The rain that month in Port Harcourt always smelled like metal and fried dough. I remember that smell first, a memory braided with the sound of my mother humming out of tune as she ironed hospital scrubs and the distant boom of my father's generator coughing to life. I was small enough to sit on the windowsill and press my face to the glass, watching the road turn into a river of umbrellas and umbrellas into a parade of colors. Already then I knew I liked colors the way some people liked music, as a thing that could change the rhythm of a day. My name is Candace Adeyemi, but back then I was just the awkward middle child who made paper dolls out of receipts. I would cut out necklines and drape a scrap of fabric over a magazine page, and pretend the models outside my reach were wearing what I imagined. My father, Ade, used to run a small tailoring shop before the cheap imports moved into town like a swarm and took the customers. He had the hands of a man who once built things. Later, he built rules. My mother, Felicia, was a nurse with a stern cross-stitch on her heart. Neither of them had time for soft things. They had mouths to feed, reputations to protect, and a son, Raymond, who would inherit the family business. There was barely room, in their tally, for a daughter who wanted to stitch her own future. Even so, I learned to steal minutes. I would wait until the house was full of the steady sound of my parents' disappointment, and then I'd crawl under the bed with a pencil and trace silhouettes until the moon went down. Some nights, I would exchange the sketches for Naira with neighborhood friends who wanted cheap dresses for parties. I would promise them a finishing touch, and then scrawl over the seams later. I was a child who learned business in the margins, who negotiated the world with a glue stick and a whisper. When I was 17, my life split into before and after. I applied for a fashion scholarship in Abuja, a small chance, an envelope with my future pressed inside. I remember how my hands shook as I pushed the acceptance letter across the kitchen table. My mother looked at it, then at my father, and I knew without words what those looks meant. "We raised you to be sensible," my father said, that evening when the rain drummed against the porch. "Not to chase gowns." He had a way of making everything sound like a sin. "You can go," he said finally, and to hear it was to breathe for the first time. "But if you do, you go alone." He meant no money, no room in the house, not for dreams that might make the family look foolish. I chose the road. Leaving was less dramatic than I had expected. No one hugged me, no one shouted. My mother held a small, thin box as if it were too heavy and placed within it a single pair of gold hoop earrings, as if to give a daughter a talisman to remember the kind of face she should show the world. My father pointed toward the door, not unkind but absolute. He said, "Remember who we are." I remember the bus swallowing the light of our street, the city receding like a bad memory. I had 15,000 Nigerian nairas in my pocket and the freckles of fear sharpening along my spine. Abuja was hard and lovely in equal measure. The city moved like a different creature with each hour. I spent my days at a fabric shop, folding bolts like prayers, inhaling the smell of cotton and new silk. The shop owner, Madam Kem, gave me scraps and odd jobs. At night, I slept in a single room with two other dreamers, Iniola, who wanted to be a singer, and Lami, who wanted a radio voice. We shared one electric fan and one dream between the three of us, and somehow it was enough. The first time I saw my own name in print, a small paragraph in a lifestyle column that called me a promising new designer, I read it aloud to my roommates and then slept like a child who had been forgiven. That small lift, a mention, a smile, made everything else tolerable. I started making gowns for small weddings, then for the odd socialite who wanted something wild and Nigerian in a way that foreign designers couldn't fake. The trick was always the same: take the old and make it sing new songs. A geli cut like a ruffle's crown, Ankara printed into a silk column that could move like modern architecture. I learned to listen to fabric the way my father once listened to the sound of a needle. But the world was not gentle. I learned early about envy and how it smells before it strikes. A rival designer, someone I thought a friend, sewed a version of my signature gown and sent it to a Lagos showroom with a story about being inspired. The showroom owner called me angry. "You've been copied." I looked at the dress and felt both flattered and small, like a child watching a bird fly away with pieces of her nest. That day I decided two rules for myself: Never let them see you panic, and never play small to appease someone else's comfort. By 23, I had an atelier with 3 assistants. We were not wealthy, but the phone rang more often, and the work was the kind that kept me on my feet. I named the label a day, a nod to my father's name, a stubborn piece of forgiveness for the man who had let me go. In the beginning, business was making ends meet. It was late nights, waiting at fabric warehouses, making phone calls that went unanswered, and showing up anyway. It was all the bracing, invisible labor no one makes songs for. But it was mine. When I think about the moment everything shifted, it was a blue afternoon at a trunk show in Lagos. I had flown in with 3 pieces packed in a rickety case. The crowd moved like tidewater. The air tasted like perfume and ambition. A foreign buyer, an elegant woman with a British accent and a smile that could calculate, stopped in front of my stand. "Who made this?" she asked. "I did," I said, and my voice had the thickness of a thing that refuses to be small. She studied the fabric, lifted a bead, turned a seam. "We have a pop-up in Shoreditch," she said casually. "We do a quarterly buy for contemporary African designers. I think your voice would translate." Translation for the fashion world means survival. She gave me a card you'd have paid small fortunes for, a path to London, to buyers who could put my clothes in windows where people actually noticed. I stopped breathing for a beat. Then I called my team, and we began to work like the stitches in a life. We made a collection with the bones of our roots and the shoulders of new worlds. I learned to ask for help, to ask for money, to borrow wisely, to make the margins make sense. London was a lesson in scale. The crowds were cold and precise, the buyers thinner and the compliments rarer. Yet a good dress is a universal language. We sold 5 pieces in the first week, then 20. The press wrote small, polite things. The buyers came back. My phone began to fill with messages of congratulations and invitations. My name, once a whisper in Abuja tailors' markets, became a small echo in the river of global fashion. Success tightened things at home. I had financed a mother's surgery once by selling a few gowns at a sample sale and watching the money roll in and become something else. I had paid for my sister's school fees. I had even once sent my father a line of rare cloth with a note for the old hands. He thanked me with a short text, "Nice." That was the sum of my reconciliation. Not much comfort, but a start. And then the rumor began. In Lagos, down the polite corridors of weekend brunches and cocktail parties, they whispered that I was more than a designer. They suggested I had an arranged connection with a politician. A few trade pages hinted at nepotism, and 2 online bloggers ran a carefully shaded headline implying that my designs only sold because of access. The story was false, but falsity, like a moth to cloth, does its damage with a soft, persistent chew. I was at a show in Milan when I got the call. My mother's number flashed on the screen. For a moment I froze, balancing a glass of wine and the scent of wool on my fingers. I should have been used to her calls by then. We'd learned how to play the script. But the voice at the other end was not the cool, anticipatory tone of a mother checking on a daughter's success. It was something smaller, more human. "Candace," she said, "your father is sick." When I flew back to Port Harcourt, the world fell off its axis. The doctor's office was a place of quiet measures, blood tests, then scans, then a thin plastic chair, and the diagnosis that made the chair small beneath me. Hypertension had taken his heart down a dangerous road. The treatment was affordable. The help was within reach. I paid the bills. That night I sat by his bed watching him sleep, and for a moment I forgot the rancor of years. A man who'd harshly set his face against the sun was suddenly vulnerable in the smallness of hospital sheets. I let my hand rest on his calluses like a map of all the rules he'd tried to build. A week later, he stood up from the hospital and went home as if new. The relief should have been clean and unambiguous, but families live in layers. At the housewarming I sent, Ade, in a move I'll never understand, took me aside and said, "You've made something of yourself. I never wanted you to go hungry." His voice was thick with something like apology. I put my hand on his arm and didn't say anything. Apologies from men who learned the power of silence are heavier than hugs. but the world had a rhythm that feeds on suspense. The rivalry that had stalked me in Lagos flared into something crueler. An established house, an old brand with connections to a certain type of patron, launched a contemporary African collection that was so close to one of my signature silhouettes the seams seemed stitched with my handwriting. I felt the shallow sink of betrayal when my phone filled with messages. "Did you see X's collection? They ripped you off." I tried not to, but I did. I sent an email to their creative director asking for an explanation. No reply. The silence felt like a slap. That night, I stood on the balcony of our London apartment, a small, glass box that we'd rented when I had just enough to pretend to be a global player, and watched the city for answers that never came. I realized then that success had a companion called danger. It was not the danger of poverty anymore. It was the danger of people wanting what I had without the work. I learned to guard not just the designs, but the story in the seams. The first real test of my resolve came in Milan, where a fashion house scheduled a collaborative show and arrayed my name beneath a list of renowned designers. The audience was electric, the lights severe. I walked the backstage corridor in a robe, waiting for the music that would make my garments speak. I felt at home in the hush before the storm. Then someone called my phone. The voice on the other end was small and terrified. "Candace," it said, "our final fabric shipment has been swapped." I tasted bile. The clocks moved slower. This was no rumor. Someone had deliberately sabotaged our show. I ran to the loading area and found crates opened, bolts of cloth slashed, embroidery boxes emptied. My heart sank but didn't stop. I called my team, my assistants, anyone who would answer. We worked like thieves in a storm. We borrowed fabric from other shows, sewed like the world depended on it, because for a designer, it does depend on it. The show could not go on with half the garments missing. When the lights rose and the models moved like tides, I expected embarrassment to swallow me. Instead, something else happened. Improvisation became a new language. The dresses that walked were different, patched together with intention and risk, and the audience, strangers who'd come to see names, rose to their feet before the last model had even left the runway. A journalist whispered, "This is genius. Reinvention." I learned then the value of resilience. I also learned the value of truth. We tracked the sabotage to a rival PR firm that had been paid to disrupt us by someone with a vested interest. It was a quiet war, waged by email and cash and the black hole of reputations. We pressed charges quietly, traded blows in libel courts, and whispered back channels. But I never lost sight of the thing I loved, making clothes that spoke. That would, in the end, be my armor. Years of hard work and small triumphs accumulated like beads, and then they braided into the thing that changes everything, the contract. It started with a cold email from a brand I'd admired from afar, a heritage fashion house with operations in New York, Paris, and Tokyo, looking to launch a new line celebrating African designers as part of a global rebranding. They asked if I would come in and present a full capsule collection. There was an offer on the table that made me catch the breath: distribution across their flagship stores, a dedicated capsule each season for 5 years, and creative direction fees that began to add up into numbers that used to live only in investors' fantasies. It should have been simple. I flew to Paris, showed my collection, watched the room. The creative director, a man with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much but still wanted beauty, stood, walked through the pieces, and then turned to me. "You have a voice," he said quietly. "We want that voice traveling across our floors. We want it in New York windows." Contracts were redlined. Lawyers blinked. The numbers were dizzy. When the final contract landed on my desk, it contained clauses that would expand my brand's reach into markets I had only dreamed of: celebrity collaborations, red carpet dressing, manufacturing deals. It was, in the language of business, a transformation. Back home, news outlets splashed the story: Candace Adeyemi to collaborate with Global House X, a new era for African fashion. My phone sang with messages. My mother called and said, all breathy and thin, "I saw you on BBC." My father sent a 2-word message: "Well done." My siblings suddenly had questions about the family business and whether I could help with some seed money. which is when I learned the cruel geometry of money and memory. When wealth enters a family, it rearranges loyalties like furniture in a room. People who turned away start circling like vultures. Some wear smiles that look like apologies. It is easy, at such moments, to let the old wound reopen. It is also easy, in the bright light of new contracts and bigger numbers, to forget why you left in the first place. The contract shook something not only inside me, but in my entire team. We had people who'd been with me since we'd used safety pins as fasteners and others hired just for the magnitude of the moment. We had to scale factories without losing our voice. We had to ensure ethical manufacturing, fair wages, and the integrity that my label had built, all while being pressed into the tight corset of global timelines. There were nights when I watched my team sleep in the office, and mornings when I watched them arrive with fresh ideas. We became ruthless in good ways, not to crush people but to protect what we had built. It was around the time the contract was about to be signed, the day when signatures are inked and futures rearranged, that the call came. My sister rang, voice small. "Can you come visit Mama? He's been asking for you." My chest clenched. The stories people tell themselves are often half-true. I knew the calendar. My father had always been proud, and pride hides fear. When I walked into the house in Port Harcourt, they stood in the doorway as if it were some domestic theater. My mother's face had a softness that had not been there for years. My father's shoulders were stooped. My brothers hovered, eyes on me like men calculating a ledger. "We're proud," they said. "We read about your contract." Their words were careful, like gloves handling a fragile thing. There was a tray of food, a small cake with my name awkwardly iced on top. The scene had been rehearsed, but what I felt was not anger so much as an old, aching recognition. The past sits in your bones like old stitches. You cannot ignore where you came from without sometimes bleeding a little. I could have let them in. I could have taken their calls and invested the family money into their small enterprises, sewing them new seams of security. But there is a line between helping and healing, and helping at the cost of erasing your scars. Instead, I invited them for coffee and then gently conducted a small experiment. I asked for the specifics of their needs in writing. They handed me a list dotted with shaky handwriting and promises. I read it, felt every memory of years folded into those words, and then I closed the document. "What you needed most," I said, "was not my money. It was my presence when you cut me out. Money cannot pay for the years I was exiled." My father's face tightened. The air between us, once thick with accusations, shimmered instead with a fragile, newly defined boundary. I offered help that wouldn't buy forgiveness, a scholarship for a niece, a grant to retool my father's old shop into a community atelier that would pay young tailors a decent wage. It was not charity exactly. It was a way to make the architecture of our past partially visible, to remake what had been broken into something useful. The real drama, the kind that keeps you from sleeping and rearranges the way you see the world, arrived the day before the final signing. I sat in a glass conference room in Paris surrounded by my legal team and the executives of the global house. The contract was a beast of clauses and contingencies. At the last minute, a clause appeared, inserted by someone in the other party's legal team, that would grant them creative rights to exclusive designs unless renegotiated within 90 days. That clause, if left, could have turned my voice into a franchise. I saw it for what it was, a slow erasure. Someone had decided that once my name carried their brand, they would keep the bones of my work in their vault and use it beyond our agreement. I remember the cold of the glass, the way the city framed itself beyond the room, and the small, furious calm that settled in me. "No," I said. It was not a negotiation line. It was a line in the sand. My lawyers murmured. The executives who wanted the deal pushed back. "This is standard for houses that need to protect investments," their creative director said. I shook my head. "My voice is not an investment you will shelf. If the agreement requires creative guardianship in the way you propose, then we are not partnering. Period." Silence. A pause. They tried to bargain. We hardened. In the end, it was my insistence, my willingness to walk away, that changed the tone. They blinked, then withdrew the clause. The signing went forward with the protections we'd asked for. Creative control clauses, guaranteed royalties, manufacturing terms that guaranteed living wages down the supply chain. We had not simply chased money, we had made a pact about what success would look like. When I signed that contract, with a pen that felt heavier than it should, I signed more than numbers. I signed a commitment to a scale that would allow my brand to feed other lives, to build factories where tailors' hands would be paid properly, to create scholarships, to make sure the babies who learned to sew in our programs had a chance at dignity. I signed, and I felt committed to the thing that had been waiting in the seams of my life. Purpose. And then my phone began to ring again. My father. My mother. The calls that had once been a measure of grief now arrived as requests and small apologies. They loved the reflection the world offered of them when the cameras flashed in my name. I had empathy. I was not heartless. But for the first time in my life, I had room to be discriminating with love. In the days and months that followed, the fashion world became my battleground and my cathedral. There were betrayals. Business partners who thought a cut of my company was a birthright, stylists who leaked my clients to competitors for a fee, and journalists who tried to sell scandal where only ambition existed. Each time, I had to decide whether to respond with a lawsuit, a social media statement, or sheer silence. I learned the elegant power of silence and the blunt power of contracts. And my family watched from the sideline as my life swelled into spaces they had not known. They tried to weave themselves back into the narrative, sending invitations to family events, asking for help with a small loan, or simply appearing at openings with fragile smiles. Some days, I let them sit in the first row. Other days, I closed the doors. In the end, the story is never about the money alone. It's about the choices that money allows you to make. For me, it was about choosing what and who I would bring into the light with me. I used the contract not to erase my past, but to build an architecture in which past and future could coexist. We opened factories, we funded education, we set up a design incubator in Abuja for young people who wanted to transform their neighborhoods through fashion. And the suspense, the slow burn that had begun in my chest so many years earlier, finally resolved not in a dramatic revenge, but in a daily, quieter triumph. I had become someone who could say, with steady breath, "This is how I will love you now," and mean it. I hope you enjoyed my story. Stick around for part 2, where I dig deeper into betrayals that came for my brand once my territory had expanded. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and push the notification bell for more videos.